The ceremony had already begun when Parker Hayes noticed her, not standing, not hidden, just seated in the second row. Natalia Hayes. The woman he had once introduced as his wife now sat quietly in a tailored ivory suit, her mobility device beside her like a detail no one knew how to address. A few guests turned. Then more. Parker smiled, but only with his mouth. He walked over, leaned down just enough, and said something low, controlled, and dismissive. Close enough for people to notice, not loud enough to be questioned. Natalia didn't respond. Because what no one in that room understood, not Parker, not his bride, not the families watching, was that the foundation beneath that wedding had already shifted. And it now answered to her. If you believe silence doesn't mean weakness, stay with this story until the end. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and what your local time is. Stories like this travel far, but truth always arrives on time. And if stories about quiet strength, justice, and consequences matter to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. The first version of their marriage had been quiet in a way most people misunderstood. It wasn't lacking. It wasn't fragile. It simply didn't announce itself. Natalia Hayes had never been the kind of woman who needed to be seen to exist. She preferred clarity over attention, structure over noise. In rooms where others spoke to be remembered, she listened to understand. It was how she had built her career before anyone ever thought to ask about it. Not loudly, not publicly, but with a precision that left very little room for error. Parker Hayes in the beginning had admired that about her. He had met Natalia at a private networking event in downtown Chicago, one of those carefully curated gatherings where ambition disguised itself as conversation. Parker had been newer then, still climbing, still measuring himself against men who had already arrived. Natalia, by contrast, had moved through the room with a kind of ease that didn't need validation. She knew where she stood, even when no one else did. He noticed that. He also noticed that others did too, though they couldn't quite place why. Their first conversation had been brief. Parker spoke more than she did. He outlined his goals, his plans, the trajectory he believed his life was meant to follow. Natalia listened, asked a few questions that cut closer to the structure of his thinking than he expected, and then moved on when the conversation had reached its natural end. It unsettled him, not because she dismissed him, but because she didn't need him to impress her. That more than anything else made him return. The relationship that followed grew steadily. Parker was attentive in ways that felt intentional. He remembered details, adjusted his behavior, positioned himself as someone who understood her quiet nature rather than being threatened by it. Natalia, for her part, allowed the relationship to develop without resistance. She did not rush. She did not test him. She observed. And what she observed in those early months was consistency. Parker showed up when he said he would. He followed through on commitments. He spoke about the future in terms that included her, not just himself. There was ambition in him, yes, but it was still balanced by effort. Still grounded in something that resembled partnership. They married 2 years later in a ceremony that reflected both of them. It was refined, but not excessive. Private, but not secretive. The kind of wedding where the details were deliberate rather than extravagant. There were no unnecessary displays. No need to prove anything to anyone. At that point, Parker still believed he had built something. He did not yet understand how much of that structure had been guided. Natalia had never made a show of her contributions. She didn't announce the introductions, she facilitated the conversations she steered, or the risks she quietly mitigated before they ever became visible problems. When Parker began to expand his professional network, it happened faster than it should have. Doors opened. Meetings materialized. Opportunities aligned. To Parker, it felt like momentum, like confirmation that his instincts were correct, that his path was unfolding exactly as it was meant to. He did not question why certain people took his calls. He did not ask how he had been included in rooms that typically required years of positioning. He accepted it. And over time, he began to believe it belonged to him. Natalia noticed the shift long before it became visible to anyone else. It started subtly, a change in tone during conversations, a slight impatience when she asked questions that required reflection rather than immediate answers, a tendency to reference his success in ways that excluded the context around it. He began saying, "I built this," instead of "we're building this." It wasn't a confrontation, not yet, just a pattern. At home, the differences were easier to observe. Parker spent more time away. Not always for work, but often framed that way. His phone became something he carried with more intention. Notifications were checked quickly. Conversations ended more abruptly when she entered a room. Natalia didn't ask for explanations. She adjusted her attention instead. She began to notice timelines. When meetings were scheduled, when they ran longer than expected, which names appeared more frequently in his conversations, which ones disappeared. There was no accusation in it, only documentation. To an outside observer, nothing was wrong. The marriage still functioned. They attended events together when necessary. Parker spoke about Natalia with a kind of polished respect in public settings, the kind that sounded appropriate without revealing anything real. "She keeps me grounded," he would say. It was the kind of sentence people accepted without examining. Natalia never corrected him, because she understood something Parker did not. Respect, when it is performed, does not need to be defended. It reveals itself over time. And time was something she had learned to use carefully. The house they lived in reflected the same dynamic. It was spacious, without being excessive, designed with intention rather than display. Natalia had chosen it for its structure, its quiet, the way it separated public space from private space, without drawing attention to the boundary. Parker liked it because it impressed the right people. Even then, the difference was already present. It simply had not yet been tested. In the months that followed, Parker's career continued to accelerate. Promotions came faster. His name appeared in circles that had once been distant. Invitations expanded. So did his confidence. So did his distance. Natalia adjusted again. She reduced her presence in his professional life without making it visible. The introductions became less frequent. The guidance more selective, not as a reaction, but as an observation experiment. She wanted to understand what would happen if the structure supporting his momentum was no longer actively maintained. The results did not appear immediately, but they did appear. Meetings became less efficient. Certain opportunities stalled. Conversations that once moved smoothly began to require more effort. Parker responded the way he always did when something resisted him. He pushed harder. He networked more aggressively, spoke more, positioned himself with greater intensity. And when results did come, as they still sometimes did, he attributed them entirely to that effort. The pattern reinforced itself. Natalia did not interrupt it. She simply recorded it. By the time the first real fracture appeared, it did not arrive as a dramatic event. It came as a sentence. "We're not in the same place anymore." Parker said it one evening, without looking directly at her, his attention partially directed toward his phone, partially toward the version of his life he had already begun constructing elsewhere. Natalia listened. She did not ask what he meant, because she already understood. They were not in the same place. They had not been for some time. The difference was that she knew exactly where she stood. Parker did not. And the distance between those two positions was already shaping everything that would follow. Natalia reached for nothing in that moment. No argument, no defense, no attempt to restore what had already shifted beyond recognition. She only noted the timing, the phrasing, the absence of accountability within it. And then quietly, she let the sentence settle exactly where it belonged. Not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something Parker believed he controlled. And something Natalia already understood he did not. The shift did not arrive with noise. It arrived in the form of a call Natalia did not answer on the first ring. She'd been reviewing a set of quarterly reports that afternoon, her attention moving steadily across columns of figures that revealed more in pattern than in isolation. The call came from an unknown number. She let it pass not out of avoidance, but because interruption rarely improved clarity. The second call came minutes later. This time, she answered. What followed was not dramatic. The voice on the other end was controlled professional, trained to deliver information without emotion. There had been an incident, a collision, not catastrophic but not minor. She was conscious, she was stable. She needed to come in. Natalia listened. She asked the necessary questions: location, condition, timeline. Then she closed her laptop, gathered her things, and left. The hospital was one of those places designed to appear calm under pressure. Clean lines, neutral colors, controlled lighting, everything arranged to reduce the visibility of urgency, even when urgency was present. Natalia moved through it with the same composure she carried into every unfamiliar environment. By the time Parker arrived, the initial assessments had already been completed. He entered quickly, his expression calibrated somewhere between concern and performance. He asked questions immediately, spoke to staff with a tone that suggested involvement, positioned himself beside her bed in a way that made it clear to anyone watching that he belonged there. Natalia observed him the same way she observed everything else, not for what he said, but for what remained consistent beneath it. The doctors explained the situation in precise terms. There was damage, not life-threatening, but significant. Recovery would require time. There would be limitations. Temporary at first, possibly longer. Parker listened. He nodded at the appropriate moments, asked about timelines, asked about outcomes, focused on the practical implications. He did not ask how she felt. Not directly. It was a small omission, one that could be explained away, one that no one else in the room would have noticed. Natalia did. The days that followed established a new structure. Hospitals operate on rhythm, check-ins, treatments, evaluations, repetition that creates a sense of movement even when progress is slow. Natalia adapted to it quickly. She asked questions when necessary, followed instructions when they were clear, adjusted her expectations without resistance. Control for her had never been about avoiding change. It had always been about understanding it. Parker, in contrast, adjusted differently. In public spaces within the hospital, he was attentive. He spoke with doctors, coordinated schedules, ensured that everything appeared managed. Nurses recognized him as engaged. Visitors saw a husband who had stepped into responsibility without hesitation. In private, the rhythm shifted. He checked his phone more frequently, stepped out of the room for calls that extended longer than required. His attention fragmented in ways that suggested his focus was no longer fully present. Natalia did not comment on it. She noted the timing instead. Calls that came at consistent hours, messages that prompted immediate responses, names that appeared repeatedly then disappeared when she entered the conversation. Patterns, always patterns. Recovery moved forward, but not evenly. There were days where progress was measurable, where movement returned incrementally, where the path ahead felt structured, predictable. And there were days where the body resisted, where effort did not translate into outcome, where limitation was no longer theoretical but present. Natalia approached both with the same discipline. She did not celebrate prematurely. She did not withdraw when progress slowed. She continued. The transition from hospital to home marked a different kind of shift. The house, once structured around ease and separation, now required adjustment. Spaces needed to accommodate movement differently. Routines needed to adapt. Small things, distances, angles, timing became variables that mattered. Parker handled the transition efficiently. He arranged what was necessary, ensured that modifications were made, presented the changes as temporary manageable, something they would move past. It was how he framed everything, as something that existed only until it no longer affected him. Natalia accepted the changes without commentary. But she began to see something more clearly. Care, when performed, follows visibility. Care, when genuine, follows consistency. Parker's care was visible. It was also inconsistent. He was present when others were watching, attentive when the situation required demonstration. But in the spaces where no one observed, his patience shortened. His tone shifted. His presence became conditional. There were moments, small ones. A delay in response when she called from another room. A sigh he did not fully conceal. A conversation cut short because something else demanded his attention more urgently. Individually, they meant little. Collectively, they formed a structure. Natalia did not react to the moments. She recorded them. Not physically, not yet, but with the same clarity she applied to everything else. At night, when the house settled into silence, Parker's distance became more visible. He stayed up later, worked from his phone rather than his office. Conversations, when they happened, were shorter, functional. "We'll figure this out," he said once. It sounded supportive. It was also undefined. Natalia did not ask what this referred to, because she already understood that for Parker, this was not a shared experience. It was a problem to be managed, and eventually removed. The first time he failed to show up for a scheduled therapy session, he explained it as unavoidable. A meeting that ran long, an opportunity that couldn't be postponed. He apologized, briefly. Natalia accepted it. Not because she believed it, but because belief was not required, only accuracy. The second time, the explanation came faster, less detailed, more practiced. The third time, he did not offer one until she asked. That was when the pattern completed itself, not in the absence, but in the expectation that the absence would no longer need justification. Natalia adjusted again. She arranged alternative transportation, coordinated directly with therapists, reduced her reliance on his presence without making the shift visible to him. Independence for her was not symbolic. It was structural. And structures once built do not require announcement. Parker noticed the change, but he misinterpreted it. He saw reduced dependency as resolution, as evidence that the situation was stabilizing, that the disruption had been temporary, manageable, contained. He did not recognize that what had changed was not the situation, but her response to it. By the time Natalia began keeping actual records, dates, times, financial access points, communication gaps, it was not an escalation. It was a continuation, a system formalized. Because the difference between observation and evidence is documentation. And Natalia had learned long ago that truth, when left undocumented, becomes negotiable. She had no intention of allowing that. The house remained quiet. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. From the inside, everything had already begun to separate. Not through conflict, but through clarity. Parker continued moving forward, convinced that momentum still belonged to him. Natalia remained where she was, understanding that movement without structure eventually reveals its own limits. And when it did, she would not need to respond, only to present what had already been there, waiting. The introduction to Madison Clark did not happen by accident. It happened in a room where introductions were rarely casual. A private fundraising dinner held in Manhattan, hosted in a restored historic building that balanced old architecture with modern influence. The kind of place where wealth did not need to be explained, only recognized. Parker had been invited through a chain of professional connections he no longer traced carefully. To him, the invitation was confirmation, another step upward, another room that proved he belonged. Natalia had declined to attend, not because she was unable, but because she had already begun selecting where her presence mattered. Parker arrived alone, carrying himself with the confidence of someone who believed momentum would compensate for anything he lacked. He moved easily through the room, shaking hands, exchanging names, placing himself in conversations that offered visibility. Madison Clark entered later. She did not command attention in the way people expected wealth to announce itself. There were no dramatic entrances, no exaggerated displays. She moved with familiarity, acknowledging people without needing to be introduced to them. Her last name did the work her presence did not need to. Daughter of Richard Clark. The detail carried weight. Parker recognized it immediately, not because he had met her before, but because he had heard the name enough times to understand its value. Clark Holdings, private equity, infrastructure, quiet ownership of assets that shaped markets without ever appearing at the surface. He adjusted his positioning without making it obvious. Conversations shifted. Routes through the room became more intentional. He allowed himself to be seen in proximity before attempting direct engagement. It was a strategy he had refined over time. Wait, observe, enter at the right moment. When the introduction came, it appeared natural. A mutual contact bridged the space. Names were exchanged. Backgrounds summarized in the kind of shorthand that left out more than it revealed. Parker spoke with measured confidence, careful not to oversell, careful not to undersell. Madison listened. She asked questions, not about his current position, but about his trajectory. It was a different kind of interest. Parker recognized it as opportunity. What Madison saw initially was potential, someone positioned just below the level she typically engaged with, but moving upward quickly enough to be worth noticing, someone who spoke in terms of growth expansion scale. It aligned with the world she had been raised in. What she did not see was context. Parker did not mention Natalia. Not directly. When asked about his personal life, he answered in broad terms. Focused on work, focused on development. Framed himself as someone fully committed to advancement. The omission was deliberate, but subtle enough to pass without challenge. Madison accepted the version presented to her, because there was no immediate reason not to. The connection did not intensify immediately. It developed through follow-up conversations. Introductions extended into meetings. Meetings into shared events. Parker positioned himself as someone increasingly aligned with Madison's world, adapting his language, his priorities, his availability. Natalia observed the change without needing confirmation. The timing of Parker's absences shifted. The names appearing in his conversations became more consistent. Madison Clark was not mentioned often. But when she was, it was always in passing, always minimized, always framed as incidental. Natalia did not question the omissions. She traced them, cross-referencing dates, events, travel schedules. Not because she needed proof of something emotional, but because she needed clarity of structure. And structure, when examined closely, rarely leaves gaps. Parker's behavior at home adjusted accordingly. He became more selective with his time, more aware of appearances. There was a refinement in how he presented himself externally paired with a gradual withdrawal internally. He no longer needed Natalia in the same way. At least, that was the conclusion he reached. What he did not recognize was how much of what he believed he had built still depended on systems he did not control. Madison's world operated differently from his. Access was not given based on potential alone. It was sustained through verification, through networks that validated each other quietly without formal introduction. Parker had entered that world through proximity, not through foundation. Natalia understood that distinction. She also understood how long it would take for that difference to become visible. Instead of confronting him, she adjusted her own position further. Introductions she might have facilitated were no longer extended. Conversations she might have guided were allowed to proceed without her influence. Information she once shared freely became selective. It was not retaliation. It was observation under altered conditions. Parker continued forward, unaware that the support beneath him had changed shape. Madison, meanwhile, continued to engage. Their interactions became more frequent, more personal. Dinners replaced meetings. Conversations extended beyond professional boundaries. Parker adapted quickly, presenting himself as someone already aligned with her expectations. He spoke about the future in terms that included her. He positioned his current life as transitional, something he was moving beyond. Natalia's existence within that narrative became increasingly abstract. A detail, a complication, something that would be resolved. Madison did not press for specifics, not immediately. In her world, timing mattered. Questions were asked when they produced the most clarity, not when they first appeared. Parker interpreted the absence of pressure as acceptance. It reinforced his belief that he was managing the situation effectively. At home, the distance was no longer subtle. It was structured. Meals were no longer shared regularly. Evenings were spent in separate spaces. Conversations, when they occurred, were functional. Logistics, schedules, necessary coordination. Natalia maintained her routine. Therapy sessions, work, reviewing records, expanding documentation beyond behavior into finance. Transactions began to shift. Small at first, amounts that could be explained individually. Movements between accounts that did not immediately signal concern. But over time, they formed a pattern. One that aligned with Parker's external positioning. Natalia noted each one. Dates, amounts, destinations. Not because she intended to act immediately, but because timing, as she had learned, determines the difference between accusation and proof. The first time Parker stayed away overnight, the explanation was immediate: a late meeting, travel complications, something that required him to remain in the city. He delivered it cleanly. Without hesitation, Natalia listened. She did not respond with disbelief. She did not respond at all, because response was not required for understanding. The pattern had already extended beyond explanation. What mattered now was completion. Madison's presence in Parker's life was no longer a possibility. It was an established direction, one that Parker believed he controlled, one that Natalia understood would eventually reveal itself fully, not through confrontation, but through structure. Because the difference between what Parker believed he was building and what actually existed beneath him was already widening. And when that distance became visible, it would not require interpretation, only recognition. Natalia did not move to close the gap. She allowed it to expand, deliberately, until it could no longer be ignored. Parker did not announce the divorce as a failure. He presented it as a correction. By the time he chose to formalize it, the narrative had already been constructed in his mind. The marriage had become something that no longer aligned with his direction. The circumstances had changed. The expectations had shifted. It was, in his words, a matter of timing and necessity. He delivered the decision in the same tone he used for business discussions: measured, controlled, detached from anything that might suggest hesitation. "We need to move forward separately." He said it in the living room, standing rather than sitting, as if positioning himself already outside the space they had once shared. Natalia remained where she was, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her attention fixed on him without interruption. He continued, "There's no conflict here. This is just practical. The word settled into the room with more weight than he intended, because practicality, when used in place of accountability, often reveals more than it conceals. Natalia did not challenge the phrasing. She did not ask for clarification. She did not ask when the decision had been made or why it had not been discussed sooner. Those questions, while expected, would not have changed the structure already in motion. Instead, she listened for something else. What he did not say. There was no acknowledgement of timing relative to her condition. No recognition of the months that had followed her recovery. No indication that the decision considered anything beyond his own trajectory. It was clean, too clean, which meant it had been prepared. Parker outlined the process that would follow. Legal representation had already been contacted. Documents would be filed within the week. Financial arrangements would be structured to ensure efficiency. Efficiency in this context meant speed. And speed, Natalia understood, reduces scrutiny. He presented the terms as fair. Temporary access to joint accounts would remain until division was finalized. Living arrangements would be adjusted in stages. Support would be provided within reasonable limits. Every phrase was calibrated to appear balanced. Every detail was designed to limit exposure. Natalia listened without interruption, because interruption would suggest reaction, and reaction at this stage would serve no purpose. "Do you have anything you want to add?" Parker asked after completing his explanation. It was not an invitation. It was a formality. Natalia considered the question briefly. Then she answered, "No." The simplicity of the response unsettled him in a way he did not expect. He had prepared for resistance, for questions, for emotion that would require management. What he encountered instead was absence, not of understanding, but of engagement. It removed friction from the process, and without friction, he moved faster. The legal proceedings began almost immediately. Parker's attorney, a firm known for handling high-efficiency separations, initiated filings with precise timing. Documentation was delivered in organized batches. Financial disclosures were presented in structured summaries rather than detailed breakdowns. To an outside observer, it appeared thorough. To Natalia, it appeared incomplete. She did not raise objections immediately. Instead, she requested copies. Full copies, not summaries, not excerpts, complete records. Her own legal representation entered quietly. Daniel Brooks was not introduced as a reaction to Parker's actions. He had been consulted earlier during a phase Parker did not recognize as significant. His approach mirrored Natalia's measured, methodical, uninterested in performance. He reviewed everything, line by line, cross-referencing disclosures with historical data Natalia had already begun compiling. The discrepancies were not dramatic. They did not need to be. Small inconsistencies, when aligned correctly, reveal larger structures. Accounts that appeared newly opened but were funded through older channels. Transfers that occurred just before filings. Valuations that reflected present positioning but omitted prior movement. Parker had not concealed everything. He had concealed enough, and more importantly, he had done so with confidence. Confidence that the process would not be challenged. Natalia did not challenge it publicly. She allowed the filings to proceed. She signed where necessary. She complied with requests that did not compromise accuracy. From Parker's perspective, the process unfolded smoothly, faster than expected, cleaner than anticipated. He interpreted Natalia's cooperation as acceptance, as confirmation that the decision had been correct. He did not consider the possibility that cooperation could exist without agreement. Living arrangements shifted accordingly. Natalia relocated first, not because she was required to, but because it simplified the process. The new residence was smaller, more controlled, designed around accessibility rather than presentation. It lacked the visual impact of their previous home, but it offered something Parker had not prioritized: function. She established her routines quickly. Therapy continued. Work in a more focused capacity resumed. Documentation expanded. Not just of financial movement during the marriage, but of the process itself. Every communication, every filing, every timestamp. Because the difference between what is stated and what is recorded becomes relevant only when both are preserved. Parker, meanwhile, adjusted to his new environment with visible ease. His schedule expanded further into Madison's world. Appearances increased. Social positioning refined. The narrative he had constructed began to solidify externally. He was seen as someone moving forward, someone making necessary decisions, someone unburdened. Madison's presence became more consistent, more visible. Though still not fully integrated into public acknowledgement, the direction was clear to those who paid attention. Natalia did, not emotionally, structurally. The overlap between timelines, financial movements, and personal decisions aligned with increasing clarity. It was no longer a question of interpretation, only of presentation. The divorce finalized within months. No drawn-out conflict, no public dispute. The outcome on paper reflected what Parker had intended: division of assets, limited obligations, clean separation. To those observing from the outside, it appeared efficient, respectful even. Natalia accepted the finalized terms without visible resistance. Because the document, while legally binding, did not represent the full structure of what had occurred. It represented what had been presented, not what had been done. That distinction remained intact and preserved. On the day the final papers were signed, Parker extended a brief acknowledgement. "I think this is for the best." Natalia looked at him for a moment, not searching for meaning, not expecting it, only confirming something she had already understood. "Yes," she said, "it is." He interpreted the agreement as closure, as confirmation that the past had been resolved. What he did not understand was that closure, when built on incomplete records, does not end a process. It delays its completion. Natalia left the office without looking back, not because there was nothing behind her, but because everything she needed from that part of her life had already been documented. And documentation, once complete, does not require revisiting, only timing. The call about the death came without urgency. It arrived early in the morning, before the city had fully committed to movement. When decisions still carried a certain clarity that noise often disrupted later in the day. Natalia was already awake. She had been reviewing a set of correspondence from the previous evening, her attention moving steadily across language that revealed more in structure than in content. When the phone rang, she answered on the first ring. The voice on the other end introduced itself as part of a legal office. Natalia recognized by name, though she had not interacted with it directly in years. The message was delivered with precision. Evelyn Mercer had passed away. The name did not require explanation. Evelyn Mercer had never been a public figure, but within certain circles her absence would register immediately. She had operated quietly, holding positions that influenced outcomes without attaching her identity to them. To most, she was a distant relative of Natalia's maternal line. To Natalia, she had been something more structured than that. A presence, occasionally visible, always deliberate. "I understand," Natalia said. There was a pause on the line, as if the person delivering the message had expected something else. A question, a reaction. Natalia offered neither. "We will need you present for the reading of the estate documents," the voice continued. "Your name is listed as primary beneficiary." Primary. The word did not surprise her. but she noted the phrasing. "Send me the details," Natalia replied. The arrangements were made efficiently. The meeting would take place in a private legal office in Boston. Attendance would be limited. Documentation would be reviewed in full. There would be no public announcement until filings were complete. Natalia closed the call and remained where she was for a moment longer. Not reflecting, not processing, only aligning, because information, when it arrives without context, requires placement before it can be understood. Evelyn Mercer had never discussed her estate directly, but she had never needed to. The structure had always been implied. Natalia prepared for the trip with the same discipline she applied to everything else. Travel was arranged without excess. Accommodations were minimal. She informed Daniel Brooks, who adjusted his schedule accordingly. "If you're listed as primary," he said during their call, "this won't be simple." "It doesn't need to be," Natalia replied. What she did not say was that simplicity and clarity were not the same thing. The office in Boston reflected the nature of the work conducted within it. No signage beyond what was necessary. No reception area designed to impress. Just controlled space, controlled access, and an environment where information moved quietly but precisely. Eleanor Whitman was already there when Natalia arrived. She stood near the far end of the conference room, reviewing a set of documents with the kind of attention that suggested familiarity rather than introduction. When she looked up, there was no surprise in her expression, only acknowledgement. "Miss Hayes," she said, extending her hand. Natalia accepted it. Miss Whitman. The recognition between them was not personal, it was structural. Eleanor Whitman had served as trustee for multiple high-value estates, including, as Natalia would soon confirm, Evelyn Mercer's. Her role was not to interpret the will, but to execute it exactly as written. Daniel Brooks joined them moments later. The room settled. The reading began without ceremony. Legal language, when constructed properly, removes ambiguity. It defines relationships not by sentiment, but by designation. It assigns value not by perception, but by control. Evelyn Mercer's estate had been structured over decades. Assets were not centralized. They were distributed across entities. Trusts layered within trusts. Companies holding positions in other companies. Real estate positioned through intermediaries. Financial instruments designed to move without drawing attention. The total valuation was not presented immediately. It was built, line by line, until the number became unavoidable. $9.2 billion. It was not spoken with emphasis. It did not need to be. The room did not react, because reaction in that context would serve no purpose. Natalia listened as the structure unfolded. Primary beneficiary, sole controlling interest in key entities, conditional oversight clauses designed to ensure continuity. It was not a gift. It was a transfer of responsibility. Evelyn Mercer had not left instructions in the emotional sense. She had left a system, one that required management, not interpretation. Daniel Brooks reviewed each section as it was presented occasionally, pausing to confirm language, to clarify implementation timelines, to ensure that no ambiguity remained within execution. Eleanor Whitman outlined the operational transition. Control would shift in phases. Immediate authority over certain accounts. Gradual integration into larger structures. Board positions to be assumed. Decisions to be made, not publicly, but effectively. Natalia did not ask how she had been chosen, because she already understood. Evelyn Mercer had not selected based on proximity. She had selected based on capability. And capability in her world had always been measured quietly. The meeting extended for hours. By the time it concluded, the structure was no longer abstract. It was defined, legally binding, operational, real. Natalia signed the necessary documents without hesitation. Each signature was not a commitment to the future. It was an acknowledgement of the present. because the system had already been built. She was simply stepping into it. Outside the office, the city moved without awareness. Traffic continued. Conversations unfolded. Nothing in the visible world reflected what had just changed. Natalia preferred it that way. Back in her temporary residence, she reviewed the initial transfer reports. Accounts had already begun shifting, access permissions updated, control redefined. It happened without announcement, without disruption, the way systems are designed to function when they are built correctly. Daniel Brooks joined her later that evening. "This changes everything," he said. Natalia considered the statement. "No," she replied. "It clarifies everything." Because nothing about Parker had changed. Nothing about the marriage or the divorce or the records she had kept. What had changed was context, the scale at which those records now existed, the environment in which they would eventually be understood. She contacted Eleanor Whitman the following morning. "Proceed with full implementation," Natalia said. "No delays." Eleanor did not question the instruction, understood. The transition accelerated. Board notifications issued. Legal filings prepared. Structures aligned under new authority. All of it conducted within frameworks that prevented unnecessary exposure. Natalia remained outside of public visibility. No announcements, no statements. No indication that anything had shifted. Because visibility at that stage would reduce flexibility. And flexibility, as she had learned, determines timing. Parker, in the meantime, continued forward without interruption. His world remained intact, his assumptions unchallenged, his trajectory as he understood it uninterrupted. He did not know that several of the financial pathways he relied on had already changed control. He did not know that entities he believed were external were now connected. He did not know that the structure beneath his future had begun to answer to someone else. Natalia did not move to reveal it, not yet, because revelation without completion creates noise. And Natalia had no interest in noise, only accuracy, only timing, only the moment when what had been done would align with what could be proven. Until then, she continued as she always had. Quiet, precise, and fully aware that what Parker believed he had secured was already operating within a system he no longer understood. Control did not arrive all at once. It settled, gradually, precisely, in layers that aligned with systems already in motion long before Natalia's name was formally attached to them. The first week after the estate transfer was defined by silence. Not inactivity, but silence. No public filings beyond what was legally required. No announcements. No adjustments visible to those outside the structure. Everything moved within channels designed to absorb change without revealing it. Natalia preferred it that way. She had no interest in spectacle, only in accuracy. Each morning began with a review. Reports from Eleanor Whitman's office arrived before 7. Consolidated summaries of accounts now under Natalia's authority. Movement across portfolios, board updates, pending decisions requiring confirmation. Natalia did not rush through them. She read line by line, because the difference between ownership and control is understanding. And understanding requires time. Daniel Brooks coordinated the legal side of the transition with the same discipline. Filings were staged carefully, jurisdictions aligned, liabilities identified and isolated before they could expand. Where Parker had moved quickly to avoid scrutiny, Natalia moved deliberately to ensure none would be necessary. By the second week, the scale of the system became clearer. Evelyn Mercer had not built a centralized empire. She had built a network, companies that held minority stakes in larger firms, financial instruments that influenced markets indirectly, properties positioned through layers of ownership that shielded their origin. even charitable foundations that doubled as structural anchors for certain tax and governance strategies. Each piece alone appeared insignificant. Together, they formed leverage. Natalia did not attempt to control everything immediately. She identified priority points, decision nodes, places where a single adjustment would ripple outward through multiple systems. That was where she focused. Eleanor Whitman noticed it. Most successors try to assert authority early, Eleanor said during one of their morning calls. You're selecting. Authority doesn't require visibility, Natalia replied. Eleanor did not argue, because she recognized the approach. It was the same one Evelyn Mercer had used. Outside of those rooms, Natalia's life remained structured but contained. Her physical recovery continued not as a dramatic arc, but as steady progression. Therapy sessions became more efficient, movement more controlled. She did not measure progress in milestones, but in function. Independence was not a goal. It was a requirement. Her residence reflected that philosophy. Minimal, adapted, organized around movement rather than appearance. There were no unnecessary elements, no attempts to recreate what she had left behind, because what she had left behind had never been designed for her. It had been designed for visibility. Now, everything served purpose. Parker, meanwhile, continued expanding his presence within Madison Clark's world. His schedule had grown more complex, filled with meetings, events, and opportunities that reinforced his belief that he had made the correct decision. His proximity to Madison provided access, and access to him meant progress. What he did not see was how fragile that access remained. Madison's world did not operate on assumption. It operated on verification. Background checks that extended beyond surface-level information. Financial reviews conducted quietly. Networks that validated each other without requiring direct confirmation. Parker had entered that world through timing. He had not yet secured his place within it. Natalia was aware of this. Not because she monitored Madison directly, but because several entities within her newly acquired structure intersected with Clark Holdings. Indirectly, subtly, but consistently. Reports began to reflect it. Minor investment overlaps, shared advisory firms, financial pathways that crossed without drawing attention. Natalia did not interfere. She observed, because interference at the wrong time reveals intention, and intention, once revealed, limits control. Instead, she allowed the systems to continue operating. She confirmed governance structures where necessary. Ensured compliance remained intact. Verified that no irregularities within her network would draw external scrutiny. The goal was not to disrupt. The goal was to understand fully before acting. Back in Parker's life, the narrative continued to refine itself. He spoke about the future with increasing certainty, about expansion, about alignment with Madison's family, about opportunities that would position him at a level he had always believed he deserved. He no longer referenced Natalia, not even indirectly. To him, that chapter had closed, resolved, contained. He did not consider that resolution requires mutual understanding, not just unilateral decision. Natalia's absence from his narrative did not remove her from the structure of his past actions. It only removed her from his awareness. And awareness, as she had learned, is not required for consequence. The financial records she had collected during the marriage were now being integrated into a broader context. Daniel Brooks worked through them systematically. What you have here, he said during one of their sessions, is not just inconsistency, it's pattern. Natalia nodded. I know. Transfers that had seemed minor within the scale of their marriage now appeared differently when placed against the backdrop of larger financial structures. Timing aligned with external engagements. Amounts corresponded with access points Parker had gained during his transition into Madison's world. Nothing illegal at first glance, but nothing entirely clean either. Daniel did not rush conclusions. We'll need to align this with current structures, he said. See where dependencies exist. Natalia agreed. Because dependency defines leverage, and leverage when applied correctly does not require force, only precision. Weeks passed, then months. The transition of the estate moved from initial control into full integration. Board positions were assumed, voting rights exercised, not aggressively, but decisively. Natalia did not attend every meeting in person. When she did, she spoke rarely, but when she did speak, decisions followed, because her authority was not based on volume. It was based on ownership. And ownership, when properly documented, does not require validation. Eleanor Whitman adjusted accordingly. "You're not just maintaining the structure," she said during a later meeting. "You're refining it." Natalia did not respond to the observation, because refinement to her was not an achievement. It was an obligation. Parker's world, in contrast, continued to accelerate. Engagement with Madison became public. Not formally announced, but visible enough that speculation formed. Appearances together, events attended as a pair, conversations that implied permanence. He had not yet proposed, but the direction was clear. Natalia received confirmation of the engagement through a third-party report before it became widely known. She did not react. She added the date to her records. Because timing matters. Engagements lead to contracts. Contracts lead to financial alignment. And financial alignment, when examined closely, reveals dependencies. Natalia's focus shifted slightly, not away from her own structure, but toward the intersection points, where Parker's future relied on systems he did not control. She did not accelerate anything. She did not initiate contact. She did not signal awareness. She simply ensured that when the time came, every record would align. Every document would support itself. Every action would be traceable. Because the difference between accusation and outcome is proof. And proof, once complete, does not require explanation. It requires presentation. Until then, Natalia continued as she always had. Quiet, deliberate, building nothing new, only clarifying what already existed, and waiting, not for opportunity, but for completion. The envelope arrived without urgency. It was delivered through standard courier service, placed among other documents that required Natalia's review that morning. There was nothing in its presentation that suggested importance. No markings beyond the sender's name. No indication that it contained anything beyond a formal notice. Natalia opened it last, not out of hesitation, but because priority to her was always determined by structure, not curiosity. Inside the card was thick, professionally printed, designed to communicate refinement without appearing excessive. The kind of invitation meant to be displayed, briefly acknowledged, and then archived. Madison Clark and Parker Hayes request the honor of your presence at their wedding ceremony. The wording was deliberate, neutral, formal, and entirely aware of its audience. Natalia read it once, then again, not for the content, but for the details surrounding it. The venue, a privately owned estate in Connecticut, one typically reserved for high-profile events with strict access control. The date, 6 weeks from now. The sponsors, not listed directly but implied through subtle design elements, affiliations, and formatting that Natalia recognized immediately. She placed the card down beside the rest of her documents. For a moment, she did nothing. Not reacting, not analyzing, only allowing the information to settle into the broader structure she had already built. Then she reached for her phone. "Daniel," she said when he answered. "I've received an invitation." There was no need to specify. A brief pause. "From Parker?" he asked. "Yes." Another pause, shorter this time. Are you planning to respond? Natalia looked back at the card. Yes. Her tone did not change, but the decision had already been made before the call ended. Later that morning, she contacted Eleanor Whitman. I need a full breakdown of the venue, Natalia said. Ownership, management, affiliated entities. Eleanor did not ask why. Give me a few hours. The response came sooner than expected. By early afternoon, a report was already compiled. The estate was held through a layered ownership structure typical for properties of that scale. Primary ownership traced back to a holding company that managed multiple event locations across the East Coast. That company, in turn, was partially financed through a private investment network. Natalia recognized the network, not directly, but through its connections. Several entities within Evelyn Mercer's estate held minority positions in adjacent funds tied to that same network. The overlap was not obvious. It was not designed to be, but it existed. Natalia reviewed the report carefully, tracing lines, mapping relationships, not to intervene, but to understand. Because understanding at this stage was more valuable than action. The invitation itself was not an act of courtesy. It was a statement, a controlled display. Parker and Madison had chosen to include her for a reason, not out of obligation, not out of respect, but as part of a narrative, one that positioned Natalia as something resolved, contained, no longer relevant. Her presence in their view would confirm that, would reinforce the idea that what had been ended had remained ended, that there would be no disruption, no complication, only closure. Natalia saw the intention clearly, which was why she accepted. The response was sent the same day, a simple confirmation, no message attached, no additional acknowledgement, just presence. Daniel Brooks visited that evening. He reviewed the invitation the report Eleanor had prepared and the notes Natalia had already begun compiling. They're confident, he said. Yes. They don't expect you to challenge anything. No. Daniel leaned back slightly, considering. Are you planning to? Natalia did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached for another document. A timeline, not of the relationship, but of transactions. Dates aligned with Parker's increasing involvement with Madison. Transfers that had occurred during the final stages of the marriage. Movements that had been presented as routine, but now existed within a different context. She placed the document in front of him. This isn't about the invitation, she said. Daniel reviewed the page. His expression remained neutral, but his attention sharpened. This connects, he said after a moment. Yes, to current structures, yes. He looked up. Then timing matters. Natalia nodded. Because timing in this situation would determine not just impact, but validity. Evidence presented too early can be dismissed. Evidence presented at the right moment cannot. Over the next several days, preparation continued without visibility. Natalia did not alter her routine. She attended meetings, reviewed reports, maintained the same structure she had established. But within that structure, additional layers formed. Documentation was organized more precisely. Financial records aligned with external verification. Communications cross-referenced with timestamps that could not be disputed. Daniel coordinated quietly with external parties where necessary. Not to initiate action, but to ensure readiness. Because readiness allows for execution without delay. Eleanor Whitman monitored the intersection points between Natalia's holdings and the entities connected to the wedding. There's no direct control, she said during one of their calls. I'm not looking for control, Natalia replied. Just clarity. Clarity in this case meant understanding exactly where influence existed, where dependencies could be identified, where assumptions made by others did not align with actual structure. Parker, during this time, moved forward without hesitation. Wedding preparations intensified. His public presence increased. Engagement announcements became formalized. Madison's family began integrating him more visibly into their network. Everything progressed according to the narrative he had constructed. Clean, efficient, upward. He did not question the invitation. To him, it was a final step, a demonstration of closure, an opportunity to reinforce the version of events he had already accepted as truth. Natalia's acceptance confirmed it, at least from his perspective. What he did not understand was that acceptance, when unaccompanied by explanation, does not confirm alignment. It confirms presence. And presence in certain contexts changes outcomes. The date approached steadily, each day removing another degree of separation between preparation and execution. Natalia did not anticipate the event. She did not imagine the ceremony. She did not consider the emotional dimension of attending. Because emotion in this case was not relevant to the outcome. Only structure was. Only timing. Only the alignment between what had been done and what could be demonstrated. On the morning the final confirmations were sent, Natalia reviewed everything once more. Documents, records, timelines. Nothing added. Nothing removed. Only verified. Because once the moment arrived, there would be no revision. Only presentation. She closed the file, set it aside, and continued with the rest of her day, as if the invitation had changed nothing. Because in truth it hadn't. It had only revealed where everything would converge. By the time the wedding date drew closer, Natalia was no longer gathering information. She was aligning it. There was a difference. Collection creates volume. Alignment creates structure. And structure, once complete, reveals meaning without requiring interpretation. The files in front of her were no longer separate documents. They had become a system. Bank records layered against communication logs. Transaction histories mapped against travel schedules. Timestamps aligned with contractual engagements Parker had entered during the final months of their marriage. Nothing in isolation appeared decisive. Together, they removed ambiguity. Natalia reviewed the material again, not because anything was unclear, but because repetition ensured precision. Each line had to support itself. Each connection had to exist without assumption. Across the table, Daniel Brooks worked through the legal framework that would eventually hold everything in place. "We're not presenting a narrative," he said. "We're presenting sequence." Natalia nodded. Because narrative invites interpretation. Sequence does not. It simply shows what happened. And when what happened is clear, interpretation becomes unnecessary. Daniel turned one of the pages toward her. "This transfer," he said, pointing to a date near the end of their marriage, "was disclosed as routine movement between joint accounts." Yes, but the destination account wasn't joint. Natalia's eyes moved to the number. She already knew it. "It was newly opened," Daniel continued, 3 days before the transfer. "And closed?" Natalia asked. 2 weeks later. She didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached for another document. An email, dated the same week. Parker confirming availability for a private meeting with representatives connected to Clark Holdings. The timing aligned. Not perfectly, but closely enough. Daniel noticed the connection as she placed the documents side by side. "This suggests preparation," he said. Yes. For what Natalia did not answer directly. Because the question, while relevant, was not necessary to the structure. Intent would become clear through sequence. They continued. Another transfer, smaller, positioned differently, but following a similar pattern. Movement from a disclosed account into an intermediary entity, then redirected again. Daniel traced the path. "This entity," he said, tapping the page, "connects to an investment vehicle." Natalia looked up. "Which one?" He referenced his notes, indirectly tied to a private fund associated with Clark Holdings. The room remained quiet for a moment, not tense, just precise, because the connection, while still forming, had begun to define itself. Parker had not simply moved money. He had positioned it in proximity to the world he intended to enter. Not illegally, not in a way that would immediately trigger consequence, but in a way that assumed no one would examine the structure closely enough to see the pattern. Natalia had, and now so had Daniel. "This changes the context," Daniel said. "No," Natalia replied. "It confirms it." Because nothing about Parker's actions had changed. Only the clarity with which they could now be seen. The next layer involved communication. Emails that had once appeared routine were now being examined alongside financial movement. Language that had seemed neutral now aligned with timing that suggested coordination, not explicit, but consistent. Daniel leaned back slightly. "If we present this correctly," he said, "it won't require explanation. That's the point. Because explanation invites defense. And defense creates delay." Natalia was not interested in delay, only in completion. Outside of those meetings, the world continued without awareness. Parker's life in particular moved forward with increasing certainty. Wedding preparations had reached their final stages. Contracts confirmed. Vendors secured. Guest lists finalized. The event itself had become more than a ceremony. It was a statement, a demonstration of alignment between Parker and Madison's world. Their future presented as inevitable. Parker carried himself accordingly, confident, measured, already positioned as someone who had successfully transitioned into a different level of life. He did not revisit the past. He did not question the decisions that had brought him here. From his perspective, everything had resolved as expected. Natalia existed only as a completed chapter, closed, contained, no longer relevant to the trajectory he had established. What he did not understand was that relevance is not determined by attention. It is determined by structure. And the structure he had built his future upon had not been examined as closely as he believed. Madison, meanwhile, continued forward with her own expectations. Her family had begun deeper integration processes, not publicly, but within the systems that governed long-term alignment, financial reviews, background confirmations. Nothing unusual for someone entering their circle. Nothing designed to challenge, only to verify. The results so far had not raised concern. Because the surface held, what existed beneath it had not yet been fully aligned with those reviews. Natalia noted that, because it meant the timing had not yet intersected. But it would, soon. Back in her own space, Natalia completed the final stage of preparation. The documentation was no longer being adjusted. It was being secured. Multiple copies, verified formats, cross-referenced indexing that allowed any element to be accessed without delay. Daniel oversaw the legal readiness. "We won't need to present everything," he said. "Just enough." Natalia considered that. "Enough to remove doubt," she replied. "Yes, because doubt is the only defense that remains when facts are incomplete. Remove doubt and defense collapses." The final document she reviewed was not financial. It was chronological, a timeline, beginning with the earliest observable shift in Parker's behavior, extending through the financial movements, aligning with his introduction to Madison, his increasing involvement, the final transfers before the divorce, the closing of accounts, the engagement, the wedding, everything placed in order. Nothing interpreted, only recorded. She read it once, then closed it. Because the structure was complete, there was nothing left to add. Only the moment at which it would be presented. The night before the wedding, Natalia did not revisit the files. She did not review the documents again. She did not prepare in the way most people would expect, because preparation at that stage was no longer necessary. Everything had already been done. Instead, she maintained her routine. Dinner at the same time, review of standard reports, communication with Eleanor regarding unrelated matters. Nothing adjusted, nothing emphasized, because control, when fully established, does not require reinforcement. It simply exists. Parker, at that same moment, was in a different environment, surrounded by anticipation, final rehearsals, conversations about the ceremony, expectations about the future. He stood at the center of it, confident that everything ahead of him had been secured, that the path he had chosen had led exactly where it was meant to. He did not consider the possibility that what had been secured was not what he believed. Natalia slept without interruption, not because the next day lacked significance, but because significance to her was defined by outcome. And the outcome had already been determined, not emotionally, not symbolically, but structurally. All that remained was timing. And timing, when aligned correctly, does not require force, only presence. The morning of the wedding unfolded with the kind of precision that only expensive events could sustain. Every detail had been accounted for. Transportation schedules aligned down to the minute. Staff moved quietly across the estate, adjusting, confirming, anticipating. The ceremony space itself had been arranged before sunrise floral installations, placed with deliberate symmetry seating structured to reflect hierarchy without appearing rigid. It was not a celebration yet. It was a system preparing to perform. Parker Hayes stood at the center of it. From the outside, there was no indication of uncertainty. His posture remained controlled, his tone measured, his movements efficient. He greeted early arrivals with familiarity, accepted congratulations without hesitation, and moved through the environment as though he had always belonged within it. Madison Clark remained inside the main residence, surrounded by a smaller, more selective circle. Her preparation was separate from the spectacle, private, structured. Her family maintained oversight without interference, allowing the process to unfold according to expectations that had long been established. Richard Clark arrived shortly after 9. He did not make an entrance. He did not need to. His presence shifted the room without requiring acknowledgement. Conversations adjusted, positions realigned, not visibly but perceptibly. He moved through the estate with quiet authority, greeting only those who required it, observing more than he spoke. When he reached Parker, the exchange was brief. "You're on time," Richard said. "Yes," Parker replied. A nod, nothing more. The approval was not verbal, but it was understood. Guests began to arrive in steady intervals. Vehicles approached along the private drive, each one checked, confirmed, and directed without delay. Names matched against lists. Seating arrangements followed precisely. There were no disruptions, no confusion, no visible errors. From a distance, it appeared effortless. Up close, it was exact. Natalia Hayes arrived without announcement. Her vehicle stopped at the designated point. The door opened. She stepped out slowly, not because she lacked control, but because she did not rush movement that required balance. Her mobility device was positioned beside her, integrated into her presence, rather than separate from it. There was no hesitation, no pause for attention. She moved forward at the same pace as everyone else. The first person to notice her did not react immediately. A glance, then a second. Recognition formed quietly. Conversations nearby shifted. Not stopped. Shifted. Because Natalia did not arrive as a disruption. She arrived as something unresolved. Parker saw her from across the entrance. The moment registered before he allowed it to show. Just a fraction of a second. Then it was gone. He adjusted his expression, maintained composure, and began moving toward her. Not quickly, not slowly, at a pace that suggested control. "Didn't expect you this early," he said as he approached. His voice remained low, measured, close enough that only she would hear. Natalia looked at him, not searching, not reacting, only acknowledging. "The invitation didn't specify a time beyond arrival," she replied. Her tone was neutral, accurate. Parker's smile remained, but it did not reach his eyes. "Well," he said, "I'm glad you came." The phrasing was correct. The intention was not. Natalia did not respond, because response would suggest engagement, and engagement was not required. Parker studied her for a moment longer, perhaps expecting something, a question, a comment, anything that would confirm she understood her place within the context of the event. She offered nothing. He straightened slightly. "There's seating arranged," he added, gesturing toward the ceremony area. "You'll be comfortable." Comfortable. The word carried a different meaning in his voice. Not concern, placement. Natalia followed the direction without hesitation. The seating had been organized into sections, each aligned with proximity to the couple. Family closest. Extended connections beyond that. Professional contacts placed with careful consideration. Her seat was in the second row, not among immediate family, not at the back, visible, but not central. She took her place without adjustment. Around her, conversations resumed. But not entirely as before. There was a subtle awareness now, a recalibration, because her presence did not fit the narrative the event was designed to present. And yet, it had been invited. Parker returned to his position near the front. From there, he could see everything. The guests, the arrangement, and Natalia. Seated, still, unmoved by the structure around her. To him, her presence represented closure, a final confirmation that the past had been acknowledged and set aside, that nothing remained unresolved, that the transition he had executed had been complete. He allowed himself to believe it, because belief once established resists contradiction. The ceremony began on time. Music started. Guests rose. The officiant took position. Madison appeared moments later, her entrance timed with precision, her movement controlled, her expression composed. Every element aligned with expectation. Parker turned as she approached. For a moment, everything narrowed. The past, as he understood it, was behind him. The future, as he envisioned it, stood in front of him. Natalia remained where she was, watching. Not the ceremony, but the structure surrounding it. The vendors, the coordination, the subtle movements of staff managing the event behind the visible layer. She recognized the patterns because she had seen them before. Not in this exact form, but in structure. Events of this scale do not operate independently. They rely on systems, financial, logistical, legal, each element supported by agreements that extend beyond the visible moment. Natalia did not interrupt the ceremony. She did not draw attention. She did not move. Because disruption was not her intention. Clarity was. And clarity requires completion. As the officiant began speaking, the environment settled into stillness. Words exchanged, promises framed. The narrative progressed exactly as it had been designed. Parker listened, responded, spoke when required. His focus remained forward, on Madison, on the moment, on the future he believed he had secured. What he did not see was the first shift. It did not come from the ceremony. It came from the edge of the structure supporting it. A staff member approached one of the event coordinators. A brief exchange, quiet, professional, but not routine. The coordinator's posture changed, slightly, not enough to draw attention from the guests, but enough to alter the rhythm behind the event. Natalia noticed. because she had been watching for it, not anticipating disruption, but recognizing alignment. The coordinator moved quickly toward another section of the estate. Communication passed without interruption to the ceremony, because the ceremony at that moment still held. Parker remained unaware. Madison continued. The officiant spoke. Everything visible remained intact. But beneath it, something had begun to adjust. Not dramatically, not yet. But enough. Natalia did not react. She did not shift her position. She did not acknowledge what she had seen, because acknowledgement would serve no purpose. The process had already begun. And processes once initiated do not require observation to continue. They require completion. Parker reached for Madison's hand. The moment held. Guests watched. Everything appeared exactly as it was meant to. Except for one detail. The structure supporting it was no longer fully aligned with what he believed. And that difference, though still invisible, had already begun to define the outcome. Natalia remained still. Not because she was passive, but because she understood something Parker did not. The ceremony was not the event. It was only the surface. And the surface, once separated from what supports it, does not collapse immediately. It holds, just long enough for everything beneath it to be revealed. The ceremony did not stop. That was the first indication that something had shifted correctly. Disruption, when it arrives too early, exposes intention. It allows time for adjustment, for denial, for repositioning. What moved beneath the structure of the wedding did not seek attention. It sought alignment. And alignment, when done properly, is almost invisible. Parker remained focused on the ceremony. His attention was fixed forward, his responses timed to the rhythm of the officiant's words. There was no hesitation in his voice, no break in posture. From the perspective of every guest seated before him, nothing had changed. Madison mirrored that composure. Her presence was controlled, her movements measured, her expression steady. The ceremony, as designed, continued to unfold without interruption. Only the system surrounding it had begun to adjust. Near the perimeter of the estate, beyond the line of sight of most guests, a second coordinator received a call. The conversation was brief. Confirmations were exchanged, names referenced, authorization questioned, not denied, questioned, which was enough. The call ended. The coordinator moved quickly not toward the ceremony, but toward the operations office set discreetly behind the main structure. Access was restricted. Entry required verification. Verification that for the first time that day did not proceed automatically. Inside, another exchange. Documents requested. Digital confirmations reviewed. A discrepancy identified. Not large, not immediate, but sufficient to require escalation. Natalia did not see these movements directly. She did not need to. The patterns were familiar. The timing aligned. And timing, once aligned, reveals sequence. Back at the ceremony, the officiant reached the midpoint. Words shifted from introduction to commitment. The structure of the vows began to take form. Guests remained attentive. The environment held its balance. Parker spoke when prompted. His voice was steady, confident. Everything about him reflected certainty, because certainty at that moment had not yet been challenged in a way he could perceive. Natalia watched him without expression. Not with resentment, not with judgment, only with clarity. Because what she was witnessing was not performance. It was assumption, and assumptions, when unsupported, do not fail immediately. They persist until they cannot. The first visible crack did not appear in the ceremony itself. It appeared in the rhythm around it. A delay, small, barely perceptible. The music that should have transitioned between segments hesitated for a fraction longer than expected. The coordinator nearest the aisle adjusted quickly, signaling to compensate. Most guests did not notice. Those trained to observe did. Natalia did. Parker did not, because his focus remained narrowed to the structure directly in front of him. Madison, however, registered it. Not consciously, but enough for her attention to shift slightly, just for a moment. Then return. The ceremony continued. Behind it, the verification process expanded. The initial discrepancy led to further checks. Ownership structures were re-examined. Payment confirmations reviewed in greater detail. Not as part of routine protocol, as a response. Because something no longer aligned exactly as expected. The estate's operational system had been designed to handle complexity. It had not been designed to ignore inconsistency. That distinction mattered. Eleanor Whitman's earlier report had identified the overlapping structures. Now those overlaps were being encountered in real time. Not as theory, but as process. Authorization for a scheduled payment had been flagged. Not denied, flagged. The entity responsible for releasing funds required confirmation of controlling interest. Standard procedure. Except that the control as recorded in the system did not match the assumptions under which the event had been organized. The discrepancy moved upward, not to disrupt the ceremony, but to ensure that the system remained accurate. Accuracy in that environment outweighed convenience. Natalia remained still, her presence unchanged, because she understood something that no one else in that space had yet realized. The process had moved beyond initiation. It had entered validation. And validation, once begun, does not reverse itself. Parker reached the moment in the ceremony where he was expected to speak his vows. He began without hesitation, words chosen carefully, delivered with the confidence of someone who believed in the structure supporting them. Guests listened, some with approval, some with expectation, some with quiet observation. Natalia listened as well, not to the words, but to the timing, because the timing of what followed would determine everything. As Parker spoke, a representative from the estate's financial management office approached the lead coordinator again. This time the conversation was longer, more detailed. Documents were referenced, names repeated, authorization requested at a higher level. The coordinator's posture shifted again. More noticeably now, still controlled, but no longer routine. A decision was made. Communication extended beyond the estate. External verification required. Because the discrepancy could not be resolved internally, it required confirmation from the controlling entity, the entity that held final authority. Natalia's phone remained silent because she had already given instruction, full implementation, no delays, which meant that the system now encountering inconsistency would follow its own logic. Not hers, not Parker's, its own. And its logic required clarity. Parker completed his vows. The officiant acknowledged them. The ceremony moved forward. Everything visible remained intact. But the structure beneath it had now fully engaged. Madison prepared to respond. Her attention for the first time did not settle immediately. There was a brief hesitation, a glance, not toward Parker, but toward the edge of the ceremony, where movement had begun to accumulate, subtle but present. She refocused, began to speak, but the shift had already occurred, not in the ceremony, but in awareness, because awareness once triggered spreads, even when unspoken. Richard Clark, seated in the front row, had also noticed, not the details, but the pattern, the small adjustments, the slight delays, the communication that extended beyond normal coordination. He did not react. He did not interrupt, but his attention sharpened, because in his world, systems did not adjust without reason. And reason, when not immediately visible, required investigation. Natalia remained exactly where she had been. Still, composed, unmoved by the changes unfolding around her, because she was not watching for disruption. She was watching for completion. The ceremony continued, but it no longer existed in isolation. It had become part of a larger process, one that had begun quietly, aligned precisely, and was now moving toward a point where it could no longer remain unseen. Not because Natalia revealed it, but because the system required it. And systems, when built correctly, do not fail. They correct. Even if that correction arrives at the exact moment someone believes everything is already secure, the ceremony did not collapse. It slowed. Not in a way that invited alarm, but in a way that interrupted certainty. The rhythm that had carried the event forward with precision began to encounter resistance. Not visible to everyone, not immediately understood, but present. Madison finished her vows. The words were clear, deliberate, aligned with expectation. The officiant acknowledged them, preparing to move into the final stage of the ceremony. By the authority, he stopped, not because he forgot, because someone had stepped into his line of sight. It was subtle, controlled. A representative from the estate's legal operations team, positioned just beyond the formal boundary of the ceremony space. Not interrupting, not announcing, waiting. The officiant paused his attention, shifting briefly toward the coordinator, who approached with measured urgency. A quiet exchange followed. Short, precise. The officiant nodded once, then turned back to the guests. "Please allow us a brief moment," he said. There was no panic in his tone, only deviation. Guests adjusted in their seats. Conversations did not begin, but attention fractured slightly. The seamless flow had been interrupted. Parker's expression remained composed, but his focus sharpened. "What's going on?" he asked under his breath. The coordinator did not answer immediately. "Just a procedural confirmation," she said. Procedural. The word was chosen carefully, because it implied routine, even when the situation was not. Madison looked toward her father. Richard Clark had already stood, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with purpose. He moved toward the coordinator before being asked. "What needs confirming?" he asked. His tone was not confrontational, but it did not allow for evasion. The coordinator hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, "Authorization for the final release tied to the event structure." Richard's eyes narrowed slightly. "That should have been cleared." "It was," she replied. "But the system requires reconfirmation due to a change in controlling interest." The words settled into the space between them, not loud enough for the guests, but clear enough for those closest to hear. Parker stepped forward. "What change?" he asked. The coordinator did not look at him, because he was not the one who held authority in that moment. "We're verifying now," she said. Richard turned slightly. "To who?" The answer came without hesitation. "To the controlling entity." Silence followed. Not across the entire ceremony, but within the circle that understood what that meant. Because controlling entity in that context was not a placeholder. It was a designation, a legal position, one that determined whether the event could proceed under the terms already established. Parker's expression shifted, only slightly, but enough. "This is unnecessary," he said. "Everything's already been approved." The coordinator met his gaze now. "Yes," she said, "under prior control." The distinction was small, but absolute. Natalia remained seated. She had not moved, had not spoken, had not drawn attention. But the structure had begun to move toward her without being directed, because the system, encountering inconsistency, had followed its own logic. Verification, authority, confirmation. Daniel Brooks stepped forward at that moment. Not abruptly, not dramatically, but with timing that aligned exactly with the pause in the ceremony. "Mr. Clark," he said, addressing Richard directly. Richard turned. Recognition did not come immediately, but it did come. "Daniel Brooks," Richard said after a moment. Yes, they had met before, not personally, but within overlapping professional structures. "Is this related to you?" Richard asked. Daniel did not answer directly. "It's related to the current controlling interest," he said. Richard's attention sharpened. "Explain." Daniel reached into his folder. Not hurried, not cautious, only precise. He removed a document, then another, placed them in Richard's hands. "Ownership records," he said. Richard reviewed them. His expression did not change immediately. Because understanding at that level requires confirmation, line by line, structure by structure. Then it did, not dramatically, but definitively. "This was updated," Richard said. "Yes," when Daniel answered without hesitation, "within the last 60 days. Richard looked up, at Parker, then back at the document. "And this entity," he began, "is now under the control of Natalia Hayes." Daniel finished. The name entered the space without being announced, without being projected. But it carried, because those who needed to hear it did. Parker's attention snapped. "That's not possible," he said. Daniel did not respond, because possibility had already been replaced by documentation. Richard looked toward Natalia. For the first time directly, she did not react to the attention, did not acknowledge the shift. She remained exactly where she had been, seated, composed, present. The coordinator spoke again. "We need confirmation to proceed," she said. But now the confirmation was no longer procedural. It was structural. Richard understood that. "Proceed with full verification," he said. Then, after a pause, immediately. The ceremony had not ended, but it had stopped. Not formally, but functionally. Guests began to register the shift. Whispers formed, not yet conclusions, but awareness. Something was no longer aligned. Parker stepped toward Daniel. "What is this?" he demanded. Daniel held his position. "Documentation," he said. For what Daniel did not raise his voice. For sequence, Parker's frustration sharpened. "This is my wedding." Daniel met his gaze. "This is a legal structure." The distinction settled without resistance, because it could not be argued. Not in that moment. Not with the documents already in circulation. Richard continued reviewing. Additional pages, additional confirmations, each one reinforcing the same point. Control had shifted, not recently, not suddenly, but legally, completely. He looked up again. "How does this affect the event?" he asked. Daniel answered. "The event relies on financial and contractual authorizations, tied to entities now under Natalia's control." Richard absorbed that. And without her authorization, Daniel did not need to elaborate. But he did. The system cannot complete execution. The ceremony, as designed, had reached a point where continuation required alignment with structures that no longer matched the assumptions under which it had been built. Parker looked toward Natalia. For the first time, not as an observer, but as someone attempting to understand. She did not return the look, because understanding at that stage was not something she would provide. It was something he would have to reach. Through the same structure he had ignored. The officiant remained in place, waiting. The guests remained seated, watching. The event had not collapsed, but it had been suspended between what had been planned and what could now be proven. Daniel stepped back slightly, not withdrawing, only allowing the structure to continue its process, because the process, once fully engaged, would not stop at a single point. It would continue until everything aligned, or failed to. Natalia remained still, because stillness in that moment was not passivity. It was control. The ceremony space did not empty. It reorganized. No one was asked to leave. No formal announcement was made. But the structure that had been designed for celebration shifted into something else entirely. Conversations remained quiet, controlled, uncertain. Guests stayed in their seats not because they understood what was happening, but because they recognized that something of consequence was unfolding. At the center of it, the absence of movement became more noticeable than any disruption. Parker stood where he had been, not at ease, not yet reacting fully, but no longer certain. Madison remained beside him, her posture unchanged though her attention had shifted. She was no longer focused on the ceremony. She was watching the exchange between her father, Daniel Brooks, and the estate representatives with a level of concentration that had replaced assumption. Richard Clark moved slightly away from the central aisle, positioning himself where he could review the documents without obstruction. His expression remained controlled, but the pace at which he turned each page had slowed. Not out of hesitation, out of precision, because what he was reviewing was no longer abstract. It was structural. "You're telling me," he said, finally looking up at Daniel, "that multiple entities connected to this event have changed controlling interest?" "Yes," Daniel replied. "And those entities now answer to Natalia Hayes?" "Yes." Richard held his gaze for a moment longer, then asked the only question that mattered. "When was this finalized?" "Within the last 60 days, Daniel said. "Fully executed within the last 30. Richard absorbed the answer, not visibly, but completely, because the timing intersected with everything: the engagement, the contracts, the financial commitments made under assumptions that were no longer accurate. Madison stepped forward. "Dad," she said quietly. Richard handed her one of the documents. "Read." She did. Her expression did not break, but it changed, not into confusion, into recalibration, because what she was seeing did not require interpretation, only acceptance. Parker moved closer. "What is this?" he asked again, his voice tighter now. Madison did not answer immediately. She continued reading, line by line, until the structure aligned. Then she looked up. At what point, she asked him, "Were you going to mention this?" The question was direct, not emotional, but it carried weight. Parker's response came quickly. "I didn't know anything about this." The answer was immediate, defensive, and incomplete. Madison watched him, not reacting, not accusing, only measuring. "Then explain the transfers," she said. She handed him another document. Daniel had not provided it directly to her, but Richard had passed it along without hesitation. Because in that moment, information no longer required controlled distribution. It required clarity. Parker looked at the page, recognized the numbers, the dates. His expression shifted again, not into understanding, into resistance. "That's unrelated," he said. "It's not," Madison replied. Her tone remained even, because she had already moved past the need for explanation. The sequence spoke for itself. Richard stepped back into the conversation. "These transfers occurred during your marriage," he said. "Yes," Parker replied, "and were not fully disclosed. They were routine. They were redirected." Richard interrupted. The correction was quiet, but final. Parker's composure began to fracture, not dramatically, but in small, measurable ways. His posture adjusted. His voice lost its earlier precision. Because the structure he had relied on was no longer supporting him, Natalia remained seated. She had not been called forward, had not been addressed directly, but the conversation had already reached her. Not through words, through alignment. Because every document now in circulation traced back to a point of control that led to her. Daniel spoke again. "We are not making accusations," he said. "We are presenting sequence." Richard nodded. He understood the distinction. Because sequence once verified removes the need for accusation. It establishes fact, and fact in his world determined outcome. Madison stepped back slightly, not retreating, repositioning. She looked at Parker again, not searching for explanation, but for consistency. "There are financial dependencies tied to this event," she said, "and they no longer align with what we were told." Parker's response came slower now. "I didn't know the structure had changed." "That's not the only issue," Richard said. He held up another page. "This is..." The document detailed the closing of an intermediary account, the same account that had received funds shortly before the divorce, the same account that had been positioned within a structure now connected to Clark Holdings. Parker recognized it. He did not deny it, but he did not explain it either, because explanation at that stage would require coherence. And coherence was no longer available. The estate representative approached again. "We need a decision," she said quietly. "Proceed or suspend." The options were clear. Continue under corrected authorization, or halt entirely. Richard did not answer immediately. He looked at Madison, then at Parker, then finally toward Natalia. She met his gaze, not with expectation, not with pressure, only with presence, because the decision was no longer hers to initiate, only to confirm. Richard understood that. "Before we proceed," he said, "I want full clarity." He turned back to Daniel. "Everything." Daniel nodded and began. He did not summarize. He did not interpret. He presented. Emails, bank records, timelines, each placed in order, each aligned with the next. No emphasis, no narrative, only sequence. As the structure unfolded, the room shifted again, not physically, but in awareness. Guests who could not hear the details began to sense the change in atmosphere. Those close enough to understand began to withdraw slightly, not leaving, but distancing. Because the event had moved beyond celebration, it had entered consequence. Parker stood at the center of it, no longer controlling the narrative, no longer shaping perception, only reacting. And reaction in that moment revealed more than any statement he could make. Madison stepped back another pace. The distance between them, though small, became defined, not by space, by understanding. Richard closed the final document. There was no need for further review. The sequence was complete. He looked at Parker, then spoke. "This ceremony cannot proceed as structured." The words were not loud, but they carried. Because they were not opinion. They were conclusion. Parker did not respond immediately, because response at that stage would not alter the outcome. The system had already reached its decision, not through judgment, through structure. Natalia remained where she had been, still, composed, unmoved. Because what had unfolded was not something she had imposed. It was something that had revealed itself, exactly as it had been built. The words did not echo, they settled. This ceremony cannot proceed as structured. Richard Clark did not repeat himself. He did not raise his voice. The statement required neither. It moved through the space with the same authority as the systems it referenced, reaching those who needed to hear it and leaving the rest to interpret the silence that followed. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because anything said would now exist against what had already been established. Parker stood in place, The position he had occupied at the center of the ceremony no longer held the same meaning. It had not been taken from him. It had been redefined. What had once represented control now represented exposure. "This is a misunderstanding," he said finally. The sentence came out controlled, but thinner than before. Richard did not respond immediately. He looked at Parker with a level of attention that did not allow for deflection. "Then clarify it," he said, not as a challenge, as a requirement. Parker's gaze shifted briefly toward Madison, toward the document still in Richard's hand, toward Daniel Brooks, who remained steady, unmoved. Then, for the first time, toward Natalia. She had not changed position, had not stepped forward, had not spoken. And yet, everything now pointed toward her. Not because she had intervened, but because the structure had aligned around her. Parker's expression tightened. "This doesn't involve her," he said. The statement lacked force, because it was no longer accurate. Daniel did not correct him. He did not need to. The documents already had. Madison exhaled slowly, not in frustration, in recognition. She stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and her father. "How far does this go?" she asked. Richard considered the question, then answered, "Far enough." Madison nodded. She did not look at Parker when she spoke again. "This wasn't disclosed," she said. Her tone remained even, but the distinction was final. Parker's response came quickly. "I didn't think it was relevant." The moment the words left him, their weight became clear, not because they were loud, but because they revealed exactly what had been assumed. Relevance in Parker's framework had been defined by advantage. What benefited him was included. What complicated that benefit was omitted. Madison did not react outwardly. But something in her posture shifted, not away from him, away from the version of him she had accepted. Richard closed the folder. There was no need to continue the review. "What matters," he said, "is not what you thought was relevant." He paused. "It's what exists." The distinction settled without resistance, because it could not be argued. The estate representative stepped forward again. "The event structure is currently suspended," she said, "pending authorization alignment." Richard nodded once. Maintain suspension. The instruction was immediate, not negotiated. The ceremony as it had been planned no longer existed, not because it had been stopped, but because the conditions required for its continuation had not been met. Parker looked around the space. At the guests, at the arrangement that had been constructed so carefully, everything remained in place, and yet none of it held. "This doesn't have to end like this," he said. The words were directed broadly, but their intention was specific: to restore, to regain, to reposition. Richard's response was quiet. "It already has." There was no escalation, no argument, only conclusion. Madison turned then, not toward Parker, toward Natalia, for the first time directly. Their eyes met. There was no hostility in Madison's expression, no accusation, only clarity, because whatever had existed between her and Parker was no longer the primary structure in the room. Something else had replaced it, something built on sequence, on documentation, on fact. Natalia acknowledged the look with a slight inclination of her head. Nothing more, because acknowledgement in that moment was sufficient. Madison held the gaze for a second longer, then looked away. Decision made, not emotionally, structurally. Parker stepped forward. "Natalia," he began. Her name sounded unfamiliar in his voice now. Not because it had changed, but because the context had. Natalia did not interrupt him, but she did not respond either, because response would suggest engagement. And engagement was no longer required. Everything that needed to be said had already been presented, not by her, by the structure he had ignored. Daniel Brooks closed his folder. His role at that stage had shifted from presentation to completion. "There are follow-up actions required," he said, addressing Richard. Richard nodded. "Coordinate with my office." It was not a request. It was alignment, because once a structure reaches clarity, the next step is execution, not discussion. Around them, guests began to adjust. Not abruptly, but with awareness that the event they had come to attend had changed form. Some remained seated. Others stood slowly. Conversations began low and controlled. No one raised their voice, because the environment itself did not allow for it. The shift had been too precise, too structured, to invite spectacle. Parker remained where he was. For the first time since the ceremony began, he did not move to correct the situation, because correction requires control. And control in that moment was no longer his. Natalia reached for her mobility device, not hurried, not delayed, only when it was appropriate. She stood carefully, her movement controlled, deliberate. There was no strain in it, no weakness, only adaptation. The space around her adjusted, not out of instruction, out of recognition. She did not look toward Parker, did not address Madison, did not seek acknowledgement from anyone in the room, because acknowledgement was not the purpose of her presence. She had not come to be seen. She had come to allow what already existed to align. And now it had. Richard watched her for a moment, not as an observer, but as someone recognizing structure. Then he inclined his head slightly. Respect, not declared, but clear. Natalia acknowledged it in the same way. Nothing spoken, nothing required. She turned toward the exit. The path opened without direction, because when structure becomes clear, movement follows. Parker's voice came again. "Quieter now. This isn't over." The words were not a threat. They were a reaction, an attempt to hold on to something that had already moved beyond his reach. Natalia paused, not turning, only acknowledging the sound. Then she continued forward, because what he described as unfinished was not incomplete. It had reached its conclusion, not in emotion, not in conflict, but in clarity. And clarity, once established, does not reverse. It settles, exactly where it belongs. By the time Natalia stepped beyond the edge of the estate, the event had already begun to reorganize itself without her. Not loudly, not visibly from a distance, but inevitably. Because once a structure is corrected, everything built on its previous form must adjust. The path leading away from the ceremony space was quiet, gravel under controlled movement, staff repositioning in the background, vehicles waiting with the same discipline they had maintained since morning. Nothing chaotic, nothing dramatic, only transition. Natalia did not look back, not because there was nothing behind her, but because everything that had required her presence there had already been completed. The driver opened the door without speaking. She entered without hesitation. The vehicle moved before the space behind her had fully settled. Inside, the environment was controlled, neutral, without interruption. For the first time that day, there was no external structure requiring her attention. No system to observe, no sequence to confirm. Only stillness. She did not reach for the documents. She did not review the files, because there was nothing left to verify. The outcome had aligned exactly as it had been built to, not through force, not through exposure, but through completion. Outside, the estate remained active, not as a wedding, but as a process. Richard Clark had already begun coordinating with his legal team. Calls were made, instructions issued, not to contain the situation, but to understand its full extent. Madison remained within the main structure, not in isolation, but in recalibration. The ceremony she had prepared for no longer existed in its intended form. What remained was information, and information in her world determined decision. Parker stayed where he had been longer than necessary, not because he expected something to change, but because movement required acknowledgement, and acknowledgement required understanding, which had not yet fully arrived. Guests began to leave in controlled intervals. No announcements, no explanations offered beyond what was necessary. The event had not collapsed. It had concluded differently. That distinction mattered, because collapse invites speculation. Conclusion invites acceptance. Natalia's vehicle moved onto the main road. The estate disappeared behind controlled turns and distance. The environment outside resumed its ordinary rhythm. Traffic, signals, movement that did not carry the weight of what had just occurred. She rested her hands lightly in her lap, not in exhaustion, not in relief, only in stillness. Because the process she had allowed to unfold had not been driven by emotion. It had been driven by structure. And structure, once completed, does not produce reaction. It produces resolution. Her phone remained silent, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that required communication had already been arranged. Daniel Brooks would manage the follow-up. Eleanor Whitman would oversee the continued alignment of the estate. Richard Clark would handle his own recalibrations. Each part of the system moving independently, yet consistently. Because once clarity is established, coordination follows. Natalia did not insert herself into that process. She did not need to. Her role had been to ensure that what existed could be seen, that what had been done could be verified, that what had been assumed could be corrected. That role had been fulfilled. The rest belonged to the structures now fully engaged. As the vehicle continued forward, the city reappeared. Buildings, movement, life continuing without interruption. It always does. Because individual events, no matter how significant to those within them, do not alter the rhythm of everything else. Natalia preferred that. She had never required the world to pause, only to align. Back at her residence, the space remained exactly as she had left it. No adjustments, no additions, because nothing about her environment needed to change to reflect what had occurred. She entered, moved through the rooms with the same measured pace, set her things in their place, everything as it should be. Later, Daniel called. "It's complete," he said. Natalia understood the meaning, not the event, the process. "Yes," she replied. "There will be continued action on their side," he added. "I expect that." A brief pause. "Then, do you want to be involved?" Natalia considered the question, not because the answer was uncertain, but because clarity requires confirmation. "No," she said, "only where necessary." Daniel accepted that, because involvement at that stage was no longer about outcome. The outcome had already been established. What remained was administration, and administration did not require presence. After the call ended, Natalia remained where she was. The quiet of the room settled around her. Not heavy, not empty, simply present. She did not revisit the past, not the marriage, not the divorce, not the ceremony, because revisiting implies something unresolved. And nothing remained unresolved. Parker would face what followed, not through confrontation, not through retaliation, but through the same structure he had once attempted to navigate without understanding. That was enough. Natalia moved to the window. The light outside had shifted. Late afternoon, the day continuing, as it always does. She did not mark the moment, did not assign it significance beyond what it had already held. Because meaning for her was not created through reflection. It was established through action, and the action had been completed. Quietly, precisely, without excess, without spectacle. She turned away from the window, returned to her work, because the life ahead of her had never depended on what she had left behind. It had always depended on what she chose to build. And now, with everything aligned, she continued, not forward, not away, simply onward. There are moments in life that do not announce themselves as turning points. They arrive quietly, unfold without spectacle, and leave behind a clarity that only becomes visible in their absence. What happened between Natalia and Parker was not a sudden collapse, nor was it a dramatic victory. It was something more deliberate. It was the result of attention to detail, to timing, to the difference between what is said and what is done. Natalia did not respond to betrayal with noise. She did not attempt to reclaim dignity through confrontation. Instead, she allowed the truth to remain exactly where it had always been, within structure, within record, within fact. And when the moment came, she did not need to speak, because the truth, when fully aligned, speaks without being raised. There is a quiet strength in that kind of restraint. Not the absence of action, but the discipline to act only when it matters. To wait not out of fear, but out of understanding. To recognize that justice is not always immediate, but when it arrives through clarity, it does not need to be defended. Parker believed control meant moving forward faster, choosing advantage, reshaping reality to fit his direction. But control without understanding is temporary. It holds only as long as it is not examined. And once it is, it reveals exactly what it was built on. Natalia never needed to take anything from him. She only allowed what was already there to be seen. If you've stayed with this story to the end, you understand something many people overlook. Silence is not weakness. It is often preparation, observation, strength that does not need to prove itself until the moment is right. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on where you are in your own life. Not what others see, but what is actually true beneath the surface. And if you feel comfortable, share where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always powerful to see how far stories like this travel. If you want more stories about quiet strength, justice, and the kind of truth that reveals itself over time, you can stay connected here. Not for noise, but for clarity.